I work at a 24-hour convenience store, one of those located on the outskirts of the city where there's almost no activity after 2 a.m. Most of the time, it's just me and my shift with a few occasional customers grabbing a snack or a drink. Nothing too interesting ever happens until he showed up. It was just another night, but this man, a regular customer, started acting strange. He always came to the counter, grabbed a drink and some snacks like it was part of his routine. But that night, he looked at me differently. He stared at me for longer than usual. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I've seen you before, in another life." I laughed, thinking he was joking or trying to make me laugh. But he didn't smile back. He just stared at me with those fixed eyes as if waiting for a reaction. At that moment, I just wanted him to pay and leave, but he kept coming back. Not every day, but often enough that I started noticing a strange pattern in his behavior. He never said much, but with each visit, he seemed more restless. Something felt off. I started dreading the possibility of him bringing up those words again. He would often say, "You know we've met before, don't you?" and then fall silent, leaving an uncomfortable tension in the air. On the night I decided to do something about it, he came into the store again. But this time, I wasn't willing to let him leave with just another one of those cryptic stares. When he walked out, I didn't hesitate. I decided to follow him. He didn't look back as he walked, which made it all the stranger. I discreetly followed him to the building where he lived, a run-down place I had seen a few times but never paid much attention to. He entered the building, and I waited a few minutes before following. But when I got there, something was wrong. The building seemed empty. I tried to get inside, but the doors were locked. That's when I noticed there was no movement around, no lights on, no one at the windows. I went to the intercom and dialed his apartment number. No response. I didn't know what to think anymore. How could the building be abandoned if he lived there? Something wasn't adding up. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the building and the man. Before opening the store, I did a quick search online about that address. I didn't find much, just the basics. The building appeared to have been built in the 1980s, but there was no mention of who lived there or even any recent occupancy. The only thing that caught my attention was a brief comment on a local forum by former residents of the area, mentioning the building's closure due to a fire. But that had happened years ago. Strangely, no one seemed to know what happened to the residents or how the building was vacated so abruptly. I went to the city hall trying to find more records about the property, but the information I received was vague and nothing indicated the building had been inhabited in recent years. How can I explain it? How could the man seem to live there, or at least act like it was his home? I decided to try a different approach. The next night, when he returned to the store, I realized I could no longer ignore what was happening. He looked at me with those fixed eyes again, and without thinking twice, I asked, "Do you live in the building next door?" He didn't answer right away, but his gaze softened as if caught off guard. Finally, he said, "Yes, I live there, but you won't find me in the same place, Lily. Not here." Those words echoed in my mind. How did he know my name? I had never told him. I was growing more confused, unable to make sense of anything. Then, without further explanation, he turned and walked away, as he always did. But this time, I knew something was very wrong. I couldn't let it go. On my next shift, I decided to return to the building and investigate further. I prepared myself to stay unnoticed, but something told me I was already being watched. When I reached the building, my suspicion was confirmed. The same dark hallways, the feeling that something was terribly off. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something drew me up the stairs to the man's apartment. When I reached the door, I noticed something even stranger. The lock was brand new. How was that possible if the building had been abandoned for years? I couldn't think straight anymore. My mind was racing. I didn't want to believe what my intuition was telling me, but the building was empty. There were no signs of life, not even traces of a recently moved-in apartment. Then, looking through a cracked window, I saw something that froze me to the core. The man was there on the other side. But he wasn't inside the apartment. He was staring at me, his eyes fixed, as if he had been waiting for me. I ran back to the store without looking back. In the days that followed, he never returned to the store. I never found out what happened to that man, but I never looked at that building the same way again. Something was happening there, and I wasn't ready to face the truth. Whatever it was, he was still there, and somehow he had always known I would see him. I never imagined that a simple midnight shift at a bookstore could turn into a nightmare. I, Tom, have always been a book lover, so when I saw the job opening at an independent bookstore in my neighborhood, I thought it would be the perfect job. The first few nights were quiet, just as I expected. The bookstore was almost empty during the late hours, with only a few dim lights illuminating the narrow aisles. However, I soon realized something wasn't right. I started noticing that as I walked through the aisles to organize the shelves, some books seemed to have moved, as if they'd been taken and then returned without me noticing. It was strange, but I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination. One night, while organizing a shelf in the back of the store, something made me stop. I was putting some books into stock when I noticed one book in particular, The Strange House. I swear I had never seen it there before. When I reached to place it on the shelf, I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was watching me. But what scared me the most was when I opened the book to check its title on the cover. On the first page, there was a message scrawled in frantic, messy handwriting. "We are waiting for you, Tom." I couldn't understand it, and a chill ran down my spine. What did it mean? How did they know my name? The following night, the feeling of being watched intensified. I tried to focus on my work, but the sound of creaking shelves and books shifting grew louder than usual. When I went back to check the shelves, I saw that more books had moved. One of them was open, as if someone had been reading it. Without hesitation, I grabbed the book, and when I opened it, I found another message. "You're closer than you think." Fear consumed me, but I couldn't stop reading. Something inside me needed to understand, needed to know who was trying to communicate and what they wanted. That night, I decided to stay later, hoping to discover who or what was behind these messages. My hands trembled, but my curiosity pushed me forward. When the clock struck 2 a.m., the bookstore was quieter than ever. That's when something impossible happened. I saw a figure at the end of the aisle, a shadow moving between the shelves. "Who's there?" I shouted, but no one answered. Fear rooted me in place, but I forced myself to go to the back of the store, where the books moved most often. There I found a hidden door. It was concealed behind a bookshelf, packed with old books, and when I pushed it open, I discovered an ancient basement. A cold sensation ran down my spine. I descended to investigate and found that the basement was filled with books, but these weren't ordinary books. There were journals, letters, and old notebooks, all with names and dates. The strangest part, my name was there. Each page spoke of someone named Tom, someone who had worked at the bookstore, someone who had disappeared. I didn't know it yet, but it was already too late to turn back. I was trapped in something far bigger than I had imagined. I was terrified, but something compelled me to keep going. As I flipped through the notebooks, I found records of others who had worked at the bookstore over the decades, all with similar stories. Endless nights, unexplainable disappearances, and an increasing sense of being watched. But the most disturbing detail was the name that appeared in every entry, Tom. Each account seemed to describe my own experience, as if someone were writing me back through time. The journal spoke of a Tom who, in some way, was part of something darker and older, something the bookstore held and fed upon. At the end of one notebook, there was a letter dated 1952. The letter was addressed to the next Tom. The text read, "You cannot leave. No one who entered has ever escaped. You will be the final piece of the puzzle, and when time erases itself, you will find your true destiny. They are already waiting." My hands were sweating as I read those words. The weight of reality began to sink in. I wasn't just in a bookstore. I was in a place that didn't just keep secrets. It devoured them. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I turned around, but no one was there. However, I heard footsteps coming from the basement stairs, and when I looked back, I saw a hooded figure standing at the door, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It pointed at me, as if summoning me. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The figure disappeared as soon as I tried to take a step forward, but the terror I felt was real. Heart pounding, I ran back up the stairs and rushed to the bookstore entrance. I wanted to leave, but the door was locked, and no matter how hard I pulled the handle, it wouldn't budge. What I didn't know was that this bookstore didn't just hold books, it held power. Something that manipulated time and space. Something that had trapped me there, just like all the other lost souls who had come before me. I didn't know how long I'd be stuck in this cycle. All I knew was that I was now part of something much greater. The books, the journals, Everything began to spin around me. I was trapped in an endless nightmare where the characters were real and I was the next victim. The truth was too terrifying to accept. The bookstore had chosen me, and I was already hopelessly lost within it. The feeling of dread enveloped me like a dense fog. The bookstore felt alive, as if its walls were breathing alongside me, pulsing with the same fear now coursing through my veins. I approached the window, hoping to see something outside that could offer an escape, but to my horror, what I saw was even more disturbing. The street outside was empty, and the city lights seemed farther away, distorted as if the bookstore existed in a world of its own. I had to get out. Every second inside the bookstore stretched time further, bending reality. I decided to go down to the basement, the wooden stairs creaking with each step. Something told me the answers were there, that everything would resolve if I faced whatever was waiting below. The basement was darker than I had imagined, with shelves of books lining the walls, coated in a thick layer of dust. But as I ventured deeper, I realized these books were different. They had no titles, only symbols and strange figures that seemed to shift under the beam of my flashlight. My stomach churned as I noticed that each of these books seemed to contain a piece of me. That's when I heard a voice. It wasn't coming from someone physically present, but from within my head, whispering my name. Tom. The voice sounded familiar, almost comforting, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. I knew that voice wasn't mine, it wasn't my conscience. In the farthest corner of the basement, shrouded in shadow, I found something I didn't expect. An old mirror, framed in dusty, cracked wood. But it wasn't the imperfections in the glass that made me stop. It was the reflection. It wasn't me staring back. It was an older version of myself, with hollow, lifeless eyes, as if I had been consumed by the bookstore years ago. I reached out to touch the glass, and the moment I did, a piercing cold shot through my body. The mirror trembled, and I watched as the image of myself smiled, a smile that wasn't mine. It blinked and gestured, as if inviting me to step closer. I wanted to scream, to run, but something drew me in, compelling me to move nearer and nearer. Suddenly, the mirror began to glow with an intense light, and I was pulled toward it, as if an invisible force were dragging me in. I tried to resist, but my muscles wouldn't respond. Just before I was completely consumed, I heard a horrific sound. The sound of pages turning, but not like the pages of an ordinary book. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart, the sound of something dreadful being written. And then, darkness. When I woke up, I was no longer inside the bookstore, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The words that echoed in my mind, the books that held my story, everything was connected, everything was consuming me. The only thing I knew for sure was that the bookstore had released me, but a part of me was still trapped there, somewhere between the pages, waiting for the next Tom.